you. Hope you're keeping well.
Yeah, and very nice to see you as well in these straitened times.
Very strange times. I think under normal circumstances we would have maybe met together and had a coffee, but we'll just have to make do with meeting at home. But yeah, nice to see you. Brendan, thanks for sending the paper over. It was really, really interesting, drawn on your experiences when you were in New Zealand. And it made me wonder why you wrote the paper.
Well, I thought, I reflected on it, and I never thought I would ever use the experience ever again. And I've worked in housing and the urban environment for nearly 35 years, and it was a 2-year part of my life that I didn't think would be useful ever in the UK, and sadly it did appear to be so. And you know, whilst this is an international pandemic and it's a once in 100-year event, it's very similar in some ways to natural disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes. It just moves at a slower pace and on a vastly different scale. So there's quite a lot of techniques and processes out there and good practice about how you manage a natural disaster, you know, and the frameworks you put in place and the communication systems you put in place. And also there's knowledge about how these disasters tend to find the weakest part of society and ruthlessly impact upon them. So if you've got failures in your health and social care system, if you've got failures in your local economy, or if you've got very poor quality housing, these disasters tend to, you know, find those and exacerbate the inequalities that you already have. And also, by looking at those disasters and how they're managed and the aftermath of them, you can also predict some of the problems which are currently hidden, which will emerge as quite serious issues we'll all have to face. And one of them is mental health, for sure. You know, there's always a time lag associated with that. And then when it appears at some scale and often takes people by surprise. So I think there's some things we can plan for. There's techniques which we can look at in terms of how we manage this, both individually as a collective, and how we might try and influence the people above us in governance roles to respond. And I just thought it was well worth putting it out just for discussion so that we can get people thinking and talking about it if possible. And also I think it's a little bit of an empowerment as well, which this isn't, you know, completely unknown to humankind. We have managed processes like this before. We do recover. So there's a hopeful element on this when you see that there is skills and techniques out there which we can deploy, and the way that we can hold people accountable as well once we get that historical perspective.
That's great, Brendan. You mentioned inequalities there, and I know that a lot of the people that we work with that do well are dealing with inequalities, whether they're in their communities, whether it's with mental health, whether it's within housing. So I'm sure some of what you've written there will really resonate with them. You also talk in the paper about the need for strong local leadership. I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, if we look at the locality, the leadership's needed at all sorts of levels. Of course, you know, our elected officials, our elected politicians and officials are quite key in coordination and trying to protect local communities from harm. But equally, all of the stakeholder institutions and big employers also have a role to play in that. And there are certain common themes, really, which we should apply to good leadership. I mean, there's absolute clear direction, clarity of purpose, clarity of objectives, the ability to shift resources where they're needed right now rather than stick to pre-planned processes, the ability to have really clear communications both internally in your organisation and externally to customers and other partners, and also the ability to step up to the plate and start to look at coordinating responses. And one of those responses will inevitably be the integration of recovery plans, because at the moment there's a whole plethora of recovery plans in every locality which are not necessarily talking to each other, and they need to quite desperately in order to get the best outcomes. So local leadership, absolutely key, but the government needs to resource local leadership in these circumstances as well. So it needs to cascade down from central government to local government to locality, and it needs to be properly resourced and managed.
Thanks, Brendan. You talked there about central government, and I just wonder how well you think the relationship between central and local government is working at the moment in this emergency that we're having in the UK.
Well, unfortunately, I wouldn't have to say, well, I have to say that it's not working well. You don't score very high marks for the leadership qualities that are currently being shown from central government. All of those issues which are referred to locally need to be also present in central government. So clarity of message, good communications, real strong sense of purpose, and being able to flex and talk to partners as equals is quite key. And none of that is happening, partly because the history of Britain is of a highly centralised state, and that's why the New Zealand example is so interesting, because it is also a highly centralised state. When they approached their earthquake disaster in Canterbury, they deployed very highly centralised responses that cut the localities out of the process. And what then happened was there was a series of suboptimal outcomes around housing and mental health and the management of people. Development was fine because they re-engineered the planning system and development processes, which you can see our government also doing with the current planning white paper. So the idea is that if we allow more promiscuous planning, then we will build our way to recovery. So it's very much about property and business and not so much about people. What then happened in New Zealand was they went through a process of a national discussion about how they need to deal with the problems in Christchurch, which emerged after the immediate damage was done by the earthquake. And you've now got a decentralised approach with a supportive government working with locally elected officials and elected members to manage emergency situations, and a wide range of objectives, including people and health and well-being. And you can actually see how that's kicked in 10 years after the earthquake with the management of coronavirus in New Zealand, because they took very quick, effective action, very clear message to the community. Everybody was on board, Team New Zealand it was called, and they've successfully at this point managed the process. We are at the beginning of that process, unfortunately. We've got a very centralised approach. We've just seen, for example, in Greater Manchester, Bolton and Trafford having to actually demand to be kept under lockdown, because what they're calling a localised approach is actually driven from Whitehall. It isn't empowering localities. There's a possibility that local government may go bankrupt in places during this emergency because of historic underfunding. So there's not adequate resources in the system, which there is now in New Zealand, particularly around public health and emergency responses. So we've got a resource-starved locality, which doesn't seem to have any real say in the centrally driven processes around lockdown and around emergency management, and a terrible communication systems and constant backtracking from government when it can't sustain its position because it hasn't got a thought through process and managerial framework to deal with the emergency that we're currently in.
And of course, we've got the expected white paper later on this month on devolution coming from the government. And I wonder whether its approach will have changed at all, whether it will be financially driven. I know there's been a recent piece of research about how much can be saved if we, move to more devolution, unitary authorities throughout the country, elected mayors, and I wonder whether that might be financially driven now.
Well, I think it is financially driven, but you raise a wider point about the management of a once in 100 years emergency, which isn't over. We're about to enter the second phase of it this winter, and that is, if you have to look at a range of different government announcements around how it's restructuring the state as though this emergency doesn't currently exist. So in the middle of a pandemic, which is destroying economy, people, lives, and place, they're announced the restructuring of the NHS, the abolition of the public health body which oversees England.
Public Health England.
Public Health England. They've announced, or they're about to announce, the restructuring of local government, in which case all normal business stops as the positioning starts to move to a new structure, and they're restructuring the civil service, all at the same time as the worst emergency in 100 years in the public health and economy field. You couldn't make it up, really. If ever you needed a message which tells you that the government isn't taking this particularly seriously, it sees it as a bump in the road to delivering a manifesto rather than a once in 100 years emergency, it would be the announcement that government is going to allow on a much wider scale what they call permitted development in town centres to allow them to recover, which means that you can turn offices and commercial premises into flats and residential without normal planning processes applying. And in some cases in London where that has already been done, you get accommodation at 13 square metres. Now, there are no planning standards, and there are no space standards really associated, well, no space standards at all associated with this. So the answer to a pandemic in terms of recovery from this government, and a pandemic which thrives on overcrowding, poor quality housing and the lack of space between people, is to encourage en masse substandard redevelopment of town centres with no space standards. That really is shocking.
Brendan, I could sit and talk to you for hours about this, and I know how passionately you feel about things. It really has been lovely to chat to you this morning. It would be great if you could come and join us, come back to one of our cafes, and we could talk about this further and explore maybe what we can all do, how we can influence what happens in the future. Would you be willing to do that?
I'd be absolutely delighted.
Oh, that's great, Brendan. Nice to see you.